keynotes and the panel discussion afterwards. Help me welcome Gary Young, please.
So I will start while that's going on. I am, and how do I move it? Just right. Okay. You can just give us. Okay. So in the run-up to the liberation of Paris during the Second World War, General de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, was concerned with the optics. It'd been just 6 weeks it had taken Germany to conquer France in 1940. And then the Vichy regime had eagerly collaborated. And the Americans and the British had provided the lion's share of the troops and firepower to force the Germans out of France. But de Gaulle wanted the French troops to be seen to be among the first to liberate the capital. And the Americans agreed. But no less concerned with optics, the Americans had one main condition: that the troops in question had to be white. Had to be. So de Gaulle met Supreme Allied Commander General Eisenhower, in future President Eisenhower, in Algiers, and a memo stamped confidential from Eisenhower's Chief of Staff read, "It is more desirable that the division mentioned above consist of white personnel." This would indicate the 2nd Armored Division as the only French division operationally available that could be made 100% white. The British, of course, agreed. General Frederick Morgan wrote to the Allied Supreme Command lamenting, "It's unfortunate that the only formation that is 100% white is an armored division in Morocco. Every other French division is about 40% white. But I've told the colonel that his chances of getting what he wants will be greatly enhanced if he can provide a white infantry division." To be clear, America was comfortable with spilling blood and spending treasure to free France, and then choreographing that freedom in a way that gave credit to the French. What the Americans could not tolerate was the sight of one of the continent's most celebrated cities and a global cultural mecca being rescued from barbarism by black troops. They called this the blanchissement, or whitening. And as Morgan intimated, it was much easier said than done. With most of the original French army captured, killed, deserted, or otherwise neutered, the Free French forces comprised 2/3 colonial troops. They drew their ranks from across West, Central, and North Africa, as well as the Middle East, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. These were the troops that assisted in the Allied liberation of North Africa, Italy, and would then land in southern France. There simply weren't enough white soldiers in any single battalion to make the plan work. De Gaulle arrived in Paris to claim back the capital after 4 cameras. cavalry, along with the celebrating crowds and po-faced officials, next slide please, is George Duxon, a diminutive, black man from Gabon, effectively photobombing de Gaulle in the nation's moment of glory. Next slide, please. De Gaulle, Duxon, next one, is wearing culottes with a white shirt, and his right arm is in a sling because he's been fighting Nazis for the last 4 days. There are also pictures of him standing on top of a tank. There are pictures of him having arrested some Nazis. And he's there as de Gaulle lays a wreath a few feet behind him, being glared at by a French official, as a reedy 6'4" de Gaulle strides stiffly down Paris's main drag. We see the small, sturdier frame of Duxon, the sole black face among a human skyline of French military kepis and balding pates. A little later we see him, next slide please, in front of de Gaulle, being manhandled by what appears to be a police officer. Duxon appears to protest, swiveling his torso around, next picture please, even as he keeps walking. And in one picture, de Gaulle is clearly aware of the fracas, turning his gaze towards the commotion to his left. So who was this man in this photograph, and why, as we approach the 80th anniversary of France's liberation, is this detail significant? George Duxon was a lover, fighter, chancer, adventurer, braggart, extrovert, and something of a scoundrel. He was born in a westerly coastal port of Port-Gentil in what is now Gabon, but was then French Equatorial Africa. His dad fought for the French during the First World War, and as a teenager, Duxon enlisted straight away in the Second World War. After 6 months basic training in what is now the Gabonese capital, Libreville, he went to France as a sergeant. He was captured by the Germans in June 1940, spent the next 2 years as a prisoner of war. After several attempts, he finally escaped in 1943, along with a wealthy industrialist, and headed for Paris, where his former prison mate / escapee employed him as a chauffeur and to run errands. There, he joined the resistance. And in the week preceding the German surrender, he fought tenaciously in street-to-street combat, earning himself the nickname the Lion of the 17th Arrondissement. Now, to be clear, I am well aware that there was a black presence in Europe, not just before the last World War, but down the centuries. The 19th century produced Alexander Pushkin, the Russian great-grandson of Ibrahim Petrovich Ganibal, who was probably born in Cameroon in the late 17th century, and French author Alexandre Dumas, grandson of a Haitian slave, who wrote The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers. Both are well known for their work and widely acclaimed on account of their ethnicity, even if the countries of their birth may have been tardy in claiming them in their entirety. Dumas was not awarded an appropriate burial place for a French writer of his stature until 2002. There were the Nadal sisters, Paulette and Jean, who held the coveted salons in interwar Paris, who were from Martinique, or the Jamaican-born Mary Seacole, who made her own way to the front in the Crimean War in the 19th century to tend to the sick. But the Blanchissement and Duxon story I want to concentrate on for now, because they take place on 2 consecutive days, and together provide a metaphor for how black people in Europe are simultaneously indispensable and yet discarded, often at the heart of the action and yet actively marginalized. Europe's history makes little sense without black people, and yet they remain the most visible people who are yet to be fully seen in its story. Because when we talk about erasure, we must be very clear that the Blanchissement, deliberately orchestrated, planned, executed by the French military on American orders and with British complicity, that this erasure is an active process. Just over 10 years ago, I interviewed the great Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano, and he told me, my great fear is that we are all suffering from amnesia. I write to recover the memory of the human rainbow, which is in danger of being mutilated. Whom, I asked him, is responsible for this forgetfulness? It's not a person, he explained, it's a system of power that is always deciding in the name of humanity who deserves to be remembered and who deserves to be forgotten. We are much more than we are told, he said. We are much more beautiful. Now, I would phrase this a little bit differently, because amnesia implies a passivity, a condition subconsciously visited upon the unwilling forgetter. But which European systems of thought have erased black people's contributions and presence from their collective memory does not indicate the accidental, absent-minded misplacement of a fact. Factors like the transatlantic trade in human beings, colonialism, or systemic discrimination don't slip one's mind momentarily like an elusive name or a date. A nation doesn't forget centuries of exploitation as a person might forget an umbrella. As the Blanchissement illustrates, nations set about these tasks with great prejudice. After all, there are a good many things that predated this particular racial journey, from Joan of Arc to Martin Luther nailing his theses on the Wittenberg's Castle Church, that took place longer ago, but that we choose to remember well. Nor is the challenge a lack of facts or knowledge. Sven Lindqvist, on the first page of Exterminate All the Brutes, writes, "You already know enough, and so do I." It's not knowledge that we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions. And in this, the most salient facts are known. These things have not been forgotten. Nations are not individuals. They do not suffer memory loss as they age. This is not a medical condition, but a political one. The willful and selective process of sifting and filtering to find the memories that fit the narrative that you are committed to, and excising, negating, and delegitimizing those that contradict it. This is how nations construct their own stories. They are made more than they are remembered. And the sense of collective memory is partial and produces a mythology that is unsustainable. In Britain, where I'm from, people will say, "We won the war," even if they weren't born, even if they didn't fight. They will say, "We won the World Cup," even if they didn't play, even if they weren't born. But when you ask them, what about slavery and what about colonialism, they say, "We had nothing to do with that. We weren't there. We weren't born." Power has many parents, but the brutality that it takes to acquire it is often an orphan. And these moments of forgetfulness, as we might call it, are unsustainable for a nation or any kind of people. So Duxon's appearance in these photographs is not merely a detail of historical interest. I know that there have been black people all over Europe, all over the world since time has begun, and we find them, and when we do, it's important to excavate and to say, there was this person in Henry VIII's court, or there was this person who was awarded a great Medal of Honor in Austria in the 17th century, or whatever. But there are moments of, or stories that are more important than just themselves. The Second World War, and we're seeing it now with the commemoration of Normandy landings and D-Day and so on, the Second World War still looms large in the European imagination. It shapes our thinking about the continent and has a profound impact on our politics, and for good reason. But in this huge, blood-soaked morality play, black people do not appear as heroes, villains, victims, perpetrators, conquerors, collaborators, or resistors. With a handful of exceptions, you will see them neither on the statues to the fallen, nor in the endless movies and books dedicated to the subject. Like Duxon on the Champs-Élysées during the Liberation, you wouldn't know they were ever there unless you went looking for them. But it actually takes quite an effort to imagine European engagement in World War II without black people. It's a bit like when you watch those shows like Friends or Seinfeld, and there are no black people in them, and it's New York. I lived in New York. It actually takes a significant effort to imagine New York without black people. White people only make up about a third of New York, and yet they are nowhere to be seen. That cannot be an error, a mistake. That is something that someone has deliberately done. It's estimated that almost 1 million Africans fought in the Second World War, as roughly around 16,000 people from the British Caribbean and several thousand from the French Caribbean. Not all would go to Europe, as Duxon did. Some would stay in Africa or the Caribbean, others were posted to Burma, India, and the Middle East. The overwhelming majority fought for Britain and France, but not all. The lion's share of Belgium's military contribution to the Allied cause came from black people. After Belgium surrendered, following just 18 days of fighting, most of its remaining troops came from Congo's 40,000-strong Force Publique, which primarily fought the Italians in East Africa and helped staff garrisons in West Africa. Once the Netherlands surrendered after 5 days in May 1940, it was left to the, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Schutterij, I think, local forces in the Dutch Caribbean colony of Suriname, located on the continent of South America, to hold the fort along with the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army until the Americans arrived 18 months later. And Suriname was vulnerable because it sat next to French Guiana, which was under Vichy France, and important because it provided most of America's bauxite, which was vital for military production. Italy recruited 256,000 Askaris to its Royal Corps of colonial troops, of whom 182,000 were from Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia, and 74,000 from Libya, though most of these were mercenaries and conscripts and proved of little military value. After de Gaulle fled France, he established the French capital in Brazzaville, which is today the capital of Congo, which led Alain Mabonkou, the Congolese writer, to make the point that that means that the French were all Congolese while Europe was at war and Germany was madly bent on conquering the planet. De Gaulle was able to move to Brazzaville because the only black governor in the French Empire, Félix Éboué, was the first to abandon Vichy and back him. The first governor to back France was Félix Éboué. And where was he from? French Guiana. The only black governor there was the one governor who stood up for the country that wouldn't allow black people on American orders to march with them come the liberation. When Algeria was eventually liberated from the Germans, de Gaulle moved his base to Algiers, where it remained until the liberation. Africa central to what was left of France. De Gaulle's bolt holes also remind us of the importance of not thinking of Europe as merely a geographical space, but also as a vast global project. And in this sense, we must distinguish between being black in Europe and being black under Europe. In 1945, for example, there were relatively few black people in Europe, and by far most of them were American soldiers. But there were huge numbers of black people who lived under Europe. Indeed, there were more black people living in British, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies than white people living in Britain, Belgium, and Portugal, respectively. And more Africans, the majority of them black, living under French rule than there were white people living in France. White Belgians in Belgium were outnumbered by black people in Belgian territories by 6 to 1. So European has not been synonymous with white. Sorry, you can go on. These are just some, you can go through these at your leisure. European has not been synonymous with white for several centuries now. And this was not primarily as a result of black people immigrating to Europe to look for work, but of Europeans traveling around the world to seize land, resources, and labor in the name of civilization. Now, I'm well aware that not all European nations had colonies, although far more of them than is commonly acknowledged had either been colonizers in Africa and the Caribbean or involved in the slave trade or other forms of forced labor. Germany's colonies in Cameroon, Togo, Namibia, and Tanzania had been taken from it after its defeat in the First World War. Italy had controlled Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, and Libya. Spain, which had once dominated the Americas and beyond, had footholds in Africa, holding on to Equatorial Guinea until '68. Denmark had slave trading forts in West Africa, which it sold to the English in the 19th century. And the US Virgin Islands, which it sold to the US. Sweden had several forts in West Africa and claimed Tobago, Guadeloupe, and St. Bart's in the Caribbean at one stage. The Norwegian controlled company Société de Merdal built and operated coconut plantations in Portuguese-controlled Mozambique. The Knights Hospitaller of Malta, a vassal state for the Kingdom of Sicily, held St. Kitts, St. Martin, St. Bart's, and St. Croix for 14 years. And even the Duchy of Courland and Semigalia, a fiefdom of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, even got in on the action, establishing a settlement in Gambia and briefly holding Tobago in the Caribbean during the 17th century. So even if not every European nation fully participated in colonialism, it was a pan-European pursuit, shaping a global economic system, the legacy of which still endures and envelops the entire continent in a project underpinned by certain racist and racial values and assumptions which enjoyed free movement throughout. When Haiti was forced to reimburse its former slave owners for the privilege of its own freedom, a payment that lasted generations after its successful slave-led revolution, the beneficiaries included the son-in-law of Nicholas I, the Russian emperor, and Prince Max von Baden, the last imperial chancellor of Germany. So even if these primarily Central and Eastern European states, which didn't have colonies, were deeply affected by colonialism in the same way that the whole of the US, was impacted by slavery, even if not all states practiced slavery, in Europe, the whole continent was impacted by slavery and colonialism, even if they didn't all practice it. The legacy may be uneven, but it was fundamental to the politics, economics, and culture of the nations, just as colonialism was fundamental to Europe. Which brings us back to the Second World War, because from the virtual extermination of the Herero people in Namibia by the Germans, to the vicious amputations inflicted on Congolese by the Belgians, the brutal means by which European states had secured and maintained control of these far-flung places belied the shock at the depths of pathology to which the continent had been reduced when it was laid bare in the concentration camps and death camps at the war's end. Tony Judt, in Post-War, writes, overseas in their colonies, European states had habitually indentured or enslaved indigenous people for their own benefit. They had not been above the use of torture, mutilation, or mass murder to coerce their victims into obedience. But since the 18th century, these practices were largely unknown among Europeans themselves, at least west of the Bug and Prat rivers. Put bluntly, to a significant extent, the shock resided not so much in the fact that they had committed these atrocities, but that they had committed them against each other. As Trinidadian-born novelist Sam Selvon would inform a British public surprised to see a black man in their midst in the 50s, we have met before. And as writer and activist Sivanandan would inform anti-immigrant protesters with shallow colonial memories, but we are here because you were there. And it is very much a living legacy. Thanks to colonial independence, the distinction between the space Europe occupies geographically and politically isn't as stark today as it was in 45, but it's still evident. Take any Euro note that might be, oh, there you go. Take any Euro note, turn to the side with a map on it, and in the far left-hand corner you'll see some dots. Much like the photographs of Duxon, if you don't know they were there, you'd miss them. But these are the islands and territories beyond the continent where the euro is used because they are still part of Europe. They represent the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Caribbean, French Guiana on the continent of South America, Reunion just east of Madagascar, the Canary Islands off the African coast. Thanks to French Guiana, if you go back now, sorry. Maybe forward. Keep going. Past the notes. Yeah. Thanks to French Guiana, France's longest land border isn't with Spain, but with Brazil. an overseas department which is every much as bit of France as the Ardennes or the Dordogne. Flights between Paris and the Caribbean island of Martinique or Madrid and Tenerife are domestic flights. Cayenne, the capital of French Guiana, is close to Paris, and Honolulu, the capital of Hawaii, America's 50th state. So the significance of seeing Duxon in that picture resides in asking ourselves how we might think about ourselves differently as a continent if the Second World War was understood as a multiracial endeavor in which black people were integral, as opposed to a conflict in which, if their presence is acknowledged at all, it is misunderstood as peripheral. In a range of ways, it laid the foundation for the continent's institutions. Avoiding another war was a rationale underpinning the creation of the European Union. The Holocaust defines Germany's relationship with the Middle East, and is the reason why most European nations don't collect statistics on race and ethnicity. It's the reason why Germany doesn't sit on the UN Security Council, while France does, even though Germany's population and economy are significantly larger. It's central to most European nations' patriotic myth-making. Austrians, who cheered Hitler's troops as they marched in during the Anschluss in 1938, have now settled on their status as, quote, the first victims of the Nazis. The resistance is central to France's self-image, even though collaborators outnumbered resistors until almost the very end. Despite rejecting at least 24,500 Jews between 1940 and 1945 and storing 450 million in Nazi gold, much of it looted from dispossessed Jews, the Swiss still pride themselves on their neutrality during the Second World War. How would the conversations about responsibility, obligation, entitlement, sacrifice, patriotism, immigration, integration, welfare, equality, and justice, as they relate to black people and migrants, how would they be discussed if their contributions in this crucial moment were fully recognized? How would we understand terms like threat to Western civilization and values of liberal democracy, so often bandied about, if we could grasp that not only that the greatest ever threat to those values in Europe over the last few centuries came from within the continent, but that black people rallied en masse to defend those values, even when the European colonial overlords decided that those values didn't apply to them. In short, how different would our view of black people's place in the continent today be if we were to spot Duxon in those pictures on August 26, 1944, and not think, what is he doing there? But instead ask, where are all the others? Until lions have historians, goes the African proverb, Duxon was called the Lion of the 17th Arrondissement. That was the title that he was given because he was such a bold fighter and he led his resistance troops in that moment on the 17th arrondissement. So he was called the Lion of the 17th. Until lions have historians, goes the African proverb, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. We could do worse than revisit the history of the Second World War through the experience of the Lion of the 17th arrondissement and start to understand where we are now as a result of where we were then. Thank you.
Which one is working? This one does. Thank you, Gary. That was very, very interesting. Before we continue, while you're building and setting up the stage, does anybody have questions from the audience? Okay. I'll allow you to let that sink in for a second. You're ready? Okay, perfect. And we'll now head to our panel discussion, Cancel Culture, the Erasure of Black Europe. And I'm very happy to have this discussion with wonderful guests. One of them is Tiffany Florville. She's an award-winning associate professor of the 20th century European women's and gender history at the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. And she specializes in history of post-1945 Europe, Black Europe specifically. Oh, you're already high. I didn't see you coming. Exactly. And she recently wrote a book that is called Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women and the Making of Transnational Movement. So thank you for being here. I'm very excited. Oh, and did I mention that she's an associate professor at the University of New Mexico? I did? Okay, perfect. Okay. Well, let me just put it like that. Mentioning it twice, right, is better than once. That is it. Then the next guest on today's panel discussion is Professor Hakim Adzi, who was the first historian of African heritage to become a professor of history in Britain when he was appointed professor of the history of Africa and African diaspora at the University of Chichester in 2015. Yesterday, I watched a talk, a keynote he held, and he said being the first African professor is actually nothing to boast about, but it rather mirrors the state of our society, and that was quite interesting. So I'd like to welcome Professor Hakim Adzi. And the third person I'd like to welcome is Johnny Pitts. He's a television presenter, writer, photographer. He's written the book Afropean, and he actually traveled basically whole of Europe to figure out how, and to document specifically how Africans and Black Europeans are living and what their reality is. So he's also worked for MTV, for BBC, Channel 4, the New York Times. We have all the big names here today. Johnny Pitts. Okay. One. Okay, now it does.
Can you give it to me? Very kind of you.
Right. I'm trying my best today. So before we dive into the panel discussion, when preparing, I thought about, okay, cancel culture and erasure of Black Europeans. What is that? So I asked myself the question, when was the first time I actually intentionally heard of a Black European historic figure? And I would like to give that question back to you. It's a question you can take home while we discuss it on the panel. And I figured like I must have been like 13 or something, and the first person I heard of was Hans-Jürgen Massacroix. And he's a Black, or he passed a couple of years ago. He was a Black journalist who grew up in Nazi Germany and later on moved to the US, etc., and worked for magazines like Ebony. And that is like the first encounter I had with an African or a Black European figure and personality, which is insane that it took me 13 years while living in Germany. So how about you? What was your first, or who was your first African European, Black European personality, historical personality that you met?
Oh,
You already have the mic in your hand. Yeah, I looked in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question in perhaps a slightly different way, because I think probably if the question was about the first well-known black person in Europe that I knew or I came to know, it was probably somebody who played football or was a singer or something. I can't quite remember, probably. So that's a little bit different from what I would see as a kind of historic or historical personality. And that's such a long time ago, I can't remember that either, so it doesn't really make any difference, but I'm going to make that distinction. But I'm going to name somebody just for the sake of naming somebody, just that I talk about somebody.
That's okay. My
It has to be okay.
my young age is quite
young?
Quite young, yeah.
Okay. So the person I'm going to mention, because it will tie in with this whole question of erasure, is somebody that you may have heard of, but I'm going to just say a little bit about them. And that is somebody called Olaudah Equiano. And Equiano was in fact his origin is disputed, but he claimed to be somebody from what is today Nigeria. He was born around about 1750, something like that. And he was a person who was, as many people from that part of Africa were in the 18th century, was kidnapped along with his sister at a young age. And eventually, after many travels, he ended up in London, in England, where he became a writer. So I wanted to keep it within the themes of writers as well. He became a best-selling writer. He wrote a best-selling autobiography about his life and what had happened to him from a young age. So that book, the interesting narrative of Gustavus Vassa, as it was called at the time, or Olaudah Equiano, the African, is a very, very important book. 'Cause he's not the first African in Europe to write a book, but he was certainly one of the first in Britain to write such a book about his own life. And it was important because he wrote it at a time when the struggle of Africans and other people in Britain against human trafficking was at its height. And in fact, that campaign, that protest against human trafficking, was probably the biggest political campaign ever in Britain's history. It involved millions of people, not just Africans, but British people as well. But it's been completely erased from the history of Britain. So how there can be a political movement involving millions of people but nobody ever learns about it or talks about it is a very good example of this erasure of history.
We'll get into erasure later on.
Okay. Can I start by saying how happy I am that we're reclaiming this term cancel culture and reappropriating it, because I often think, very often that term is used by sort of middle-aged white men to talk about somebody having said something racist and people people holding them to account for that. And every time somebody says that's cancel culture, I say, no, do you want to know what real cancel culture is? It's European missionaries dominating with their own ideas of what religion should be. Cancel culture is the Middle Passage, transatlantic slavery. That's what a culture being cancelled really looks like. So I'm just happy to be speaking about cancel culture on those terms, rather than bringing up, I don't know, some white guy who said something off key and doesn't like being pulled up about it. Following on from Hakeem in a way, my first cultural figure from Black Europe was definitely a footballer, like a lot of other people. You couldn't describe these as historic figures, I suppose, but I just remember specifically a lot of the stuff coming out of the Netherlands, especially the genius footballers who were at Milan at the time, thinking of Frank Rijkaard and Ruud Gullit, and those iconic photographs of Ruud Gullit in the 1988 European Championships in a orange Dutch shirt. That was such a powerful thing for me. But also what other stuff coming out of the Netherlands at the time. I remember this band, quite a cheesy pop band called Two Unlimited, and just think, here is some black Dutch people making music, and that was a way in for me. But to go further back, I think of Raymond Williams, who talks about how culture is ordinary. And actually, I want to claim some of these figures. I think you can look to sport as important historical figures. And so I would say the first person that I really that really brought my attention to not only the presence of a Black European history, but also a colonial history would be Eusebio, who was one of the greatest footballers of the 20th century and played for Benfica when Benfica were a dominating power in football. And there's a reason why Benfica were a dominating power during that particular moment, is because it was under Salazar, and Salazar that regime was taking footballers from all the colonies to power up Portuguese football at that time, and Eusebio was one of the players who was brought over from Mozambique, and in some ways probably not enslaved is the wrong word, but totally dominated by Salazar's regime. He wouldn't. Real Madrid tried to sign him, and he wasn't allowed to sign for Real Madrid. They completely owned him in Portugal. So I think that actually, even though it seems a bit wishy-washy to claim a footballer as your first historical figure, I think actually that was a good lesson for me in looking at popular culture and seeing the layers beneath it that can tell a much deeper, richer story that isn't just about popular culture.
Thank you. I'd like to just say I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It sounds like crickets, sort of. So I think my first figure, historical figure. Should we use the other one? Sort of, kind of. Hello? Okay, we'll make it work. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So we don't hear it anymore. So I think my first figure was Josephine Baker. And sort of going on the theme of not really thinking about historical figures, although musicians, writers, artists, I consider them all historical figures. So, but for me, it was sort of Josephine Baker in Paris, also spending time in Germany, spending time in Vienna, and her experiences across Europe. And then I think a follow-up for me, so in addition to sort of music, Josephine Baker, but then Sade, sort of thinking about her as a British, Black British musician and her music, particularly in the US. And then sort of those sort of seeing sort of Black women in the European context as sort of strong figures was a very important moment for me. And sort of being able to sort of see Blackness beyond, oh boy. We're getting a lot of excitement with the microphone, so just gonna make it work. I think for me, just sort of seeing Blackness beyond the U.S. centered narratives. Although sort of Josephine Baker was African American, she spent years in Paris, was a part of the resistance, adopted numerous children. So sort of seeing Blackness beyond the confines of the U.S. border was really important for me. And then I think a second moment for me, sort of a second aha moment, I was sort of 18. I just arrived in Germany as an exchange student. And I was sort of reading and sort of trying to figure out. And I learned about sort of Maya Im and Katharina Guntoya, sort of black German feminist activists who helped to sort of bring about this movement. And through sort of reading a volume that they edited, Farbe kennen or Showing Our Colors, I learned about William Anton Amo, who was an 18th century Enlightenment thinker, who was a lawyer, a philosopher. He was a goldsmith in Ghana. He was a part of the royal family. It was sort of layers of black history that were open to me that allowed me to see beyond my sort of, diasporic circle, which was basically my parents are from the Caribbean. I had an entrance in that. But then when I lived in Germany, I could see like, wow, the sort of diaspora was so multivariant, very complex in ways that I hadn't previously really recognized. So for me, it was sort of the entry point was women, was always sort of women, and then sort of seeing how women were able to sort of write these narratives and sort of create stories of blackness that had a richness to it.
Yeah, my voice is a bit cracked, so I can't even do without a microphone. But it's very fascinating. All the figures and stories you mentioned are basically just the tip of the iceberg, and their stories always highlight not only individual achievements, but I feel like also point to an overlooked narrative in a way. So building on that, I would like to delve into a larger historical context. So Hakima wondered, what are some of the most significant, or maybe what is one of the most significant historical contributions of Black and African people in Europe, and that has been systematically erased or marginalized in mainstream media or mainstream history?
Wow. I mean, there's so many that we could mention. I think I'm going to go back to Equiano again, because I think that's from the point of view of British history and this whole struggle against human trafficking. The role that Africans played in that period was very, very important. So having people give first-hand testimonies about the impact of kidnapping, enslavement, and so on was very important for this movement, as I explained in my last answer, that was developing in Britain at that time in the 18th century. It gave it a new focus, a new authenticity, and so on. And Equiano and other people toured around the country giving lectures and talking to people in that period, and they talked to range of people, ordinary people, working people, miners, factory workers, as well as others who were involved in this mass movement. So I think that was very, very important. And Equiano was also a member of an organization called London Corresponding Society, which was a kind of radical movement of that time, which was actually banned by the government. So that whole movement was very, very important. It was so important, as I say, it was the government of the day in Britain tried to completely eliminate it, and subsequently it's been, as I said, more or less completely erased from history. But there are many, one could think about many other examples. The whole development of Pan-Africanism, which is something else that I write about a lot, was really based in Europe in its early period. I always say it's really based in Britain, and everything is important is based in Britain. But it also had its center in France, in Paris, in Brussels, in Belgium, in Lisbon, in Portugal, and of course right here in Hamburg. Hamburg was a very important center of the whole development of Pan-Africanism. especially during the 1930s with the famous Pan-African conference that was held right here in Hamburg, perhaps the most important of all the Pan-African gatherings that was held, which also there have been great attempts to erase that from history as well, and what its significance was. So if you don't know about that gathering that was held here, then you should definitely find out something about it. So I think that though all those kind of contributions are very important, of course there are other cultural contributions that one could also talk about. But I think that, as I say, these political contributions, political movements are important, because we have to remember that all of those Africans who were organizing here or in London or in Paris and so on were playing an important part in developing much broader movements of resistance and of opposition and so on, that we sometimes forget about, or we think they didn't exist or they weren't that important. But they are important, and they are our predecessors, if you like. I'm a person who I'm always very concerned about you could say the human condition, and how we become the decision makers in any situation. And most of us, in fact all of us, live in countries where we're not the decision makers. So those who preceded us, those who fought, who struggled, who sometimes gave their lives to change the conditions of people in Europe, because we're talking about Europe, but also fought to change the conditions of people in Africa, the Caribbean and other parts of the world, to me are extremely important people.
Can I ask a question to that sentence already? Because you already mentioned that Pan-Africanism has like influenced the lives of many, and you already mentioned important key moments being the conference here. So can you shortly explain how the histories of Black Europeans connect to or with a broader global histories and movements?
Well, people were here because they were usually forced to be here in various ways. I mean, either people were kidnapped and transported to Europe, or people were compelled by economic necessity to come to Europe to work, or compelled by very often colonial conditions to come to Europe for an education. So there are many. So if we look at, particularly in the last 500 years, of course there were Africans in Europe. We can go back a couple of thousand years or even longer and find Africans here. But if we're talking about the last 500 years, there were usually reasons connected to the way the world has been over the last 500 years, which has been a world in which the big powers to work together for the liberation of all, which is really what Pan-Africanism is about. So that movement, which developed in Europe, also worked alongside anti-colonial movements in these various countries and tried to inform them and develop them and so on and so forth. So that's really the importance. And Africans played a very important role in that, and many of them are largely unknown. So we have people like Otto Huiswoud, for example.
We are getting into some people in a bit.
Just to mention one, but there are many who, as I say, are not very well known and need to be much better known, because we can be inspired by and encouraged by and learn from their experience.
Well, at least whoever's leaving here today has at least 4 people they know now, because all of us mentioned at least one. You mentioned multiple. So thinking, I'll just hand this to you directly to ask the next question. So what I'm taking from your input right now is how crucial it is to like recognize global connections and somehow stand in solidarity with various Black histories, African histories, and movements. And considering that, Tiffany, because I find it very interesting that as an American you decide to write a book on Afro-German women, and considering that, how have these women that you've spoken about and written about shaped local and transnational movements, and what lessons can current activists learn from their experiences? Does it also like help us to look at this from an intersectional perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my first books was Mobilizing Black Germany. Oh, boy. We're getting a lot of excitement today. I'm loving it. It's like I'm on my toes. Yeah, so the first book was Mobilizing Black Germany, where I focus on Black German women, queer Black German women, straight Black German women, and how they were connected to feminist movements across the globe. So they are practicing intersectionality before it's even coined. They're concerned about class, race, gender, sexuality, etc. And they're working with feminist women not only from the US, certainly the most famous one, Audre Lorde, and her partner Gloria Joseph, but they're also working with feminists in the Netherlands. So Gloria Vecka, Philomena Assad. They're working with women in France. They're working with women in Britain. So there is a concerted effort to connect with Black women across the European continent, as well as in Zimbabwe, in Ghana. So they're really looking for these connections, these diasporic connections. And they do so willingly. And I think I'm extremely impressed by what they're able to do, because this is an age without sort of digital connections. So they're doing this without the internet. They're doing this without sort of TikTok, FaceTime or Facebook, or FaceTime for that matter. They're doing it without any of these entities. They're doing it by word of mouth. They're doing it by using newspapers. They're doing it by actually going to people's houses and knocking on doors. So this is like truly grassroots organizing that I think is extremely inspiring and different in how it takes place today. And then I think what's so fascinating about these women is that they're actually going to these conferences. So they're connected to feminist networks across the globe. They're traveling to conferences in Brazil, in Canada, in the US, and they're linking up with Black women across the globe, consciously forging connections, writing letters to them. So some of the material that I've come across is that they're literally writing, letters of appreciation to one another. Now we're going to sort of write an email. I mean, it's hard for us to even think about snail mail in the same way where you're like, I'm going to write a letter to someone. I just easily write an email or even, WhatsApp them, basically. But then they're writing to one another. They're expressing their admiration. They're expressing frustration. They're asking for strategies. They're asking for book recommendations. So all of this is really quite significant in a moment where they have less sort of technological tools than we have today, or fewer, I should say. And so I think that's been really amazing to see. And they're also linking up with sort of queer networks across the globe. They're linking up with queer networks in Canada. They're linking up with queer networks in the UK. So there's a conscious effort to forge tangible connections with other women across the diaspora, and to sort of continue to maintain those kinships in ways that I think really is a model in ways of how Black activists can sort of use those sort of efforts at kinship to sort of mobilize today. And I think
very intentional and genuine.
genuine, they're sort of nowadays we talk about sort of chosen family. I see this sort of sense of like this idea of creating chosen families across the globe, tackling anti-racism, tackling neo-fascism, tackling classism, tackling homophobia, all of this. And I think in the US there's a sort of sense of like, 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term intersectionality, so it didn't really exist before then. And it's like, no. Black activists in Europe knew that the battles they were fighting were overlapping battles. It was not coined intersectionality then, but they knew that all of these sort of discriminatory practices were interlinked. And so I think it's fascinating that women were doing this. I mean, they're still doing it. I'm not suggesting people aren't active today, but I think there's a different way that people are going about it. And I think part of that is also seeing the significance and the importance of like digital activism and how digital spaces are used to mobilize people in ways that are similar, there's sort of parallels, but also quite different.
But what does that mean for you as writers, authors, historians, photographers, students, etc.? If there's like, we're not only getting the lectures, that you use for your research, but now there's this huge digital sphere that is adding to it, and tons of material. So what challenges have you faced when you did your research and checked through the documentation of the histories of Black Europeans, especially today with the internet?
Yeah. So there were lots of difficulties, I think. First of all, I sort of conducted some research in Berlin and then also a little bit in Hamburg. And I think sort of finding Black people in the archives, that's always, especially finding Black women, that's always a challenge. And there's always a challenge in terms of dealing with like white German archivists too, in terms of them. My positionality as a Black woman is already, challenged. I shouldn't be in that space. And what, you're asking about Black people too? Ugh. And so sort of interesting, I mean, they didn't say that, but but the tone and the look and the comportment, the body comportment, I knew I was not wanted in some of those spaces. So for me, it was actually important to go to like subcultural spaces, like feminist archives, lesbian archives, and where I found traces of Black German activists. Advertisements for journals, advertisements for events that were taking place. So I was able to sort of draw, sort of basically become a detective, excavating these sources and looking for traces of Black people in presumably non-traditional archives, so to speak. And then another important aspect for me was forging connections with activists. Who then invited me to their homes and spent hours with me talking and sharing materials that they'd collected. So they opened up their homes and then opened up their personal archives to me. And so in the process of like researching kinships, I was also practicing and engaging in the production of like kinships, many of which that I'm still, in contact today. And every time I'm in the city, they're like, when are you coming over? And I'm like, I'm coming over when we set up a date. So I think it's important to sort of think about non-traditional archives, sort of personal archives, and how the archive is actually in the everyday. And so that's something that was really important for me in terms of seeing, because, as a trained historian, blah, 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 it's like the archives are important, but the archives are sort of like, in these traditional spaces. And we forget that people are collecting materials. Those are archival riches as well that don't get acknowledged in ways that should. And so for me, it was like the archives are in the everyday, along with sort of intellectual activism in collecting and curating those materials. And so I could see sort of Black German activists as not only sort of important, political figures, but also intellectuals, creating knowledge, collecting knowledge, doing all of these really remarkable things in ways that had not previously been given credit for. And so I think that's that's been interesting to see, and especially in a field, you know, especially thinking about like European history, European studies. It's often considered predominantly white, and so talking about the significance of like Black knowledge production and Black knowledge creation in spaces that are deemed to be predominantly white has also been important. A challenge too, because people are like, what?
Johnny, what about you? I mean, you've traveled Europe in search of Afro-European history, everyday life, etc. So what obstacles did you face when you were traveling, but also when you were preparing, when you were doing your research and
being broke and unofficial, you know, like, to be honest, you know, like having no money, no publishing deal, and no connection to an academy or any kind of official institution. But you know, sometimes something that powered me up was this Sartrean idea of the loser wins or the winner loses. And sometimes when you're operating from a place of absence, that's where creativity can happen. There's a beautiful Erykah Badu lyric where she said, "My dress ain't cost nothing but $4, but I made it fly," you know, and that her not having the money made her creative, you know, and so I think that's obviously at the time I would have preferred to have had money and a publishing deal, but like just kind of trying to philosophically think about my position. I actually started to draw strength from that, and just picking up on a word that you mentioned, Tiffany, this notion of traces. I did my whole book back to front, so it's like the research came after the traveling in some ways. I had made some preliminary notes, but that was a really important way to discover these stories that had been invisible, because it wasn't a top-down approach. It wasn't like, well, this happened in Germany and I'm going to set up an interview with this person. It was looser than that, and that had its own kind of weird logic. And I think of this notion of the desire path. So you know, when you're walking along a street and there is the street, and then you have to go this way and then left, right? The official path is this way and then left. But over many years, people haven't been following that path. They've been going across, and there's like a muddy dirt path, which is where the kind of people have really been going. You know, like these sort of it's evidence of this kind of divergent path that is not part of the official path. And actually, writing a book where I'm heading out and I don't have many resources and I'm speaking to everyday people, that was a way of dealing with the notion of the unofficial, of people who have been invisible, and me having to work things out, and people telling me things. You know, I'd be in Stockholm, and I knew that. I mean, I should say as well that I set up an online community before I made the journey, which powered the journey. So like before. No, it was Facebook. You know, it was before we really knew what Facebook was doing with the Cambridge Analytica. But it was like in 2009, I think it was. I set up an Afro-European, and very quickly it got like about 10,000 followers, and they would like. I'd constantly liaise with them, and sometimes they would even like say, "Oh, if you're going to Portugal, I know someone you can stay with them," and it helped save me money, but also just gave me like local knowledge, like a local organic network that I could follow, and then. But very often, I knew I had to go to Rinkeby, say in Stockholm, which is an area that is 80% Muslim on the outskirts of Stockholm. And I would meet somebody there and have a conversation that would be extraordinary. And then it was like after the fact, I'd have to place that everyday conversation in history. Why was that person there? And what is the significance of what they were telling me in terms of an alternative history of Europe? And suddenly, to place the everyday and the casual experience and root that in history was a very powerful thing, because something that I think frustrated me when I was at school is the way that history was taught. It had no connection to especially because it was mostly white people. You know, it felt like it had no connection to my present everyday experience. And so I grew up, you know, I think of that Goethe quote, you know, a person who cannot draw on 2,000 years is living hand to mouth. And that's really true, but you have to make that connection between those 2,000 years and your present. And so doing things in a kind of back to front way allowed me to make those spectral connections, those historical connections, and really make sense of it in the present context. And that I found that a real I don't know, like a psychoactive ingredient in my work, to realize the importance of these banal, seemingly banal everyday encounters.
Thank you for that. You mentioned something that I found very interesting, and it's a perfect link, actually.
Oh, sorry.
And that's a perfect link, actually, because you said something by history not being interesting in a way because the people who fought the teach it are predominantly white and it's set in a very Eurocentric perspective. So therefore it's something I can completely relate to your back to therefore taking today and then putting it in context. And that is something that you have been are also familiar with. Students who do not want to study history because they feel like, oh, history, we don't see ourselves there as black students, as non-white students. So I can also imagine that that fact itself is a hindrance and an obstacle when it comes to historical research because you do not probably do not make use of a different perspective. And concerning that, what strategies did you find engaging when you first started to bring history or make history interesting, more interesting for black students?
Well, history is always interesting for my personal students. But I know where you're going. I know where you're going. Well, no, because history is fascinating. So, but I think that the problem that we have is, and this is not this is just a kind of reflection that we have. I don't know, 3 people talking about history, and none of them are really based in Germany. So we have kind of similar problems in Britain. That you heard that I was the first person of African heritage to become a history professor. So that's a problem. That's not a cause for celebration. So where is everyone? So when you are put in that position, you then have a responsibility to make sure there's some others. So 10 years ago, I'm going to cut a long story short, but this was a problem. So we called a conference in London, at which all the speakers, bar 1 or 2, were all students, were all black students from schools, from universities, undergraduate, postgraduate, and so on, to try and find out what the problem was, or to get people discussing the problem. So that the main thing people said was, the main thing that Johnny has said, the main thing that we would all say, that history is always presented from a Eurocentric perspective. It erases Africans and so on and so forth. So we started a project for young people, now called the Young Historians Project, which is designed to get young people to engage with history. In other words, basically they develop their own projects, whatever they want to do, and we give them the kind of skills that they need to fulfill those projects. So we're in our 10th year. We have, I don't know, at the moment, probably about 30 young people between the ages of 16 and 25. The last project they did was about African women in Britain. They interviewed over 30 women who were all in the health sector. Historically, a lot of women have come from the African continent to Britain to work as not only as nurses, also doctors and so on and so forth. But there was a time when if you did a Google search for African women and Britain, you would get no responses at all. There was nothing. So we decided, okay, we would do this project. So if you go online now, Young Historians Project, you can see all the work they did, all the interviews are there. They did some historical research on African women in the health service going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And there are photos and so on and so forth. So those kinds of initiatives are very, very important, that we encourage young people to get involved. Now some of those young people who were part of our project are now doing their PhDs. A couple of them have already got their PhDs. One of them just curated a major exhibition at the British Library in London called, what's it called? Beyond the Baseline, I think it's called. She was one of the first members of the Young Historians Project. So this kind of work is very, very important. As historians, we can't just do our own research. We have to facilitate the work and encourage other young people to get involved. And now, obviously, all of them are doing very important research. One of the others is actually doing research on, again, on black women organizing in Britain in the 1970s, 1980s. She hasn't finished her PhD yet, but she's already produced a book on one of the most important of these women activists in Britain, a woman called Gerlin Bean. I don't know whether you're familiar with that name. She was one of the key activists in Britain. Again, nobody has commemorated her, but there's now a book called Gerlin Bean, Mother of the Movement, by A.S. Francis, who's one of these young historians and also one of my PhD students. So this is the kind of work that is very, very important. I'm going to just take the liberty of, as you've asked me the question, of talking about the master's program that we set up in, whenever it was, 2017, 2018, which also came out of the same conference, because people said at that conference, well, we need some way of encouraging slightly older people to train as historians. So what can you do? So that's when we set up the master's program, Masters by Research in the History of Africa and the African Diaspora, at the university that I was teaching at that time, which was about 5-6 years ago. We ran that program for 6 years. We produced 7 PhD students out of that program. 6 of them at the University of Chichester. One of them was actually in the US. The program was completely online. It was open to everybody in Hamburg or anywhere in the world. We had people from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and so on. So as some of you probably heard, last year that program was summarily closed, and then that was used as an excuse to sack me. So I lost my job. So now we have the 15 students that I was supervising, which are all black students, 10 of them doing PhDs, 6 of them doing master's program, have been without a university or any supervision for the last year. So if you go online, you'll see the campaign that we've been waging, because this is how our history is attacked. One of the ways in which it's attacked. They not only attack those of us who are professors, of course, but they attack the courses which facilitate more people coming through under all kinds of pretexts. So these are some of the challenges, but also some of the possible solutions to encourage young people, more young people, to take up this very important role of writing our histories, writing and disseminating and researching these important histories.
Thank you. With your program, you also use like various media forms. I've seen that you have a podcast or exhibitions, etc. And Johnny, you as a photographer, author, writer, you engage with various media forms as well. So how do you think media representation of Black Europeans has evolved, and what impact does it have on public perception?
It's a complicated one, because I think I started out Afropean in a very sort of naive way, thinking I'm gonna document Black Europe, and at the end of it, I sort of didn't know what black meant anymore. I didn't know what European meant. It was I didn't know what it meant to document, and when you should document or not document. Not everybody wants to be documented, and I think especially in a black context is you meet a kind of underground networks, people who for whatever reason don't want to be documented, and then B, you're dealing with a lot of what I sort of describe as ghosts, where you like as a photographer, what's really difficult is thinking about how to photograph things that aren't there anymore, like these very often through various gentrification or whatever, like a lot of important black spaces that I wanted to photograph are not there anymore, and so I think within that you try and work with technology in different ways. You deal with texture a lot more in my work. I realized that by the end of it I was dealing with a kind of partly inspired by a notion kind of coined by the sociologist Paul Gilroy, where he talks about black vernacular culture, and that's been really inspirational in thinking of like how you can preserve or document something in ways that aren't always obvious, and he talks particularly powerfully about the notion of James Brown. And if you hear James Brown yelling, there's more going on than first seems. That's an expression of the inexpressible, and you can learn more from a James Brown yell about the black experience in America than you can about through 1,000 essays. And so these alternative ways of trying to document dealing with texture and moods and atmospheres has been really important, and I see that a lot, like with some of the photographers especially that are coming through now, a whole range of black photographers. I mean, one of the people who started this, who's just started to become very well known again, but was on the almost being forgotten about, is Roy Decarava, the African-American photographer. And at the Black Archives, actually, in Amsterdam, I was very I'd moved when I found a first edition of Roy Decarava and Langston Hughes' Sweet Flypaper of Life, signed by Langston Hughes to Hermina Hiswald, which was an incredible document to have. But what Decarava dealt with was photography at the edge of failure. So if you look at the etymology of the word photograph, ancient Greek photos, light, graphos, to write, you can think of a photograph as a medium through which we write with light. And what Decarava did was challenge the whole history of the way light is used in photography, and especially the Shirley cards. So a lot of the chemicals were used to favour pale skin in photography. And he said, well, I'm going to not deal with light, I'm going to deal with shadows, I'm going to deal with the low end. So he was photographing dark skin in jazz clubs in the 1950s, and what comes with that is camera shake, blur, imperfections, which actually you can see. In fact, I think one of his books is called The Sound I Saw. You can see jazz visually, which is a very powerful idea. And I think a lot of, when I look at some of my favourite photographers who are working now, they're dealing with textures. One of my favourite photographers who everybody here should really think about, I think at one point, I think she was, she might have a connection to Hamburg. Was it? I think she was spent time being raised in Hamburg, but now lives in London and has been living in London for a long time. A photographer called Liz Johnson Arta, and she has I think a Russian mother, spent time living in Bulgaria, and then I'm sure it was Hamburg she lived in for a while. But when you look at her images, it completely sort of disobeys the rules of what classic documentary photography should be. And she uses a compact camera, and the images almost feel like they're from a family album. And which I think actually that notion of the family album visually is a really powerful source for black photographers to draw from when black photographers were sort of blocked professionally. To look at this aesthetic of the family album and the beauty and the honesty and the rawness that is captured in black family albums, I think is something that you see in the work of people like Jamel Shabazz and especially Liz Johnson Arta. So I'm seeing what I've seen in the last 10 years, especially with photographers, people really drawing on this different aesthetic tradition that really flies in the face of of kind of Magnum or whoever the big photographers are, and working out, well, what does black life feel like, not just look like, but what does it feel like? And that's helped me that's what I learned from Afropean is dealing with texture rather than just trying to find ways to document people and things that either don't want to be documented or aren't there. Like, out of that kind of lack, what kind of aesthetic or what kind of writing emerges out of that space of absence?
I think it's what you said is very interesting, asking the question what black lives feel like. And I think that is something you can truly experience through personal archival pieces or photographies or letters, anything that is like very personal. You feel it probably in a different way than traveling to places and not staging, but trying to capture the current feel of a space, for instance. Before I hand over to audience questions, there's something I would like to ask you in terms of the current state of black Europeans, and also looking at it from a historical view. What stories still need to be told, and maybe even the question how we can simplify research for the next generations so they can keep on telling these stories. Maybe Tiffany, you'd like to start.
Yeah, I don't want to simplify these, the approaches. I think, I mean, I understand the sort of phrasing. I just think, for people, it's sort of seeing themselves reflected in history. So I think really exposing students, which is what I do in the U.S., to the dynamics, the contours,